didn't come expecting to get any drinks today because it's Sunday. We're closed.
Right. Hello, Mr. Goddard, we're here.
Hello.
We'll take that cold beer now. Have a seat if you'd like, folks.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Nick Goddard. My given name was Nicholas. All my friends called me Nick. My enemies called me Nicholas. Nobody ever called me Nicholas. I was a friend to everybody, or at least they were my friend. I was born in Belgium in 1853, came over to this country in 1871. I was in Chicago. I walked into a train depot and said, I want to go 40 miles west of Chicago. And this is where I ended up. Went to work for a farmer east of town here. I worked on a farm in the old country in Belgium, and so I fit right in. Then I got a job as the barkeeper down at the Center Hotel. That was pretty good business, so in 1884 I opened my own saloon in the first floor of the Shaw Hotel, which was on the northeast corner of Chicago and Spring Street, right next to the railroad tracks. Well, people would be waiting for the train, and they'd be in my establishment refreshing themselves before the train came. Well, it was right across the street from City Hall, too, so we'd have folks from City Hall come in. We had Mayor Pierce come in, and Police Chief Freeman, he'd stop by, and we'd always talk about politics. Of course, politics was something really big to talk about those days. We had a guy in the White House by the name of Grover Cleveland. Boy, I tell you, that guy was something. He had an illegitimate child when he voted him into office. And on top of that, while he was in the White House, he had a young lady that he was the legal guardian for. And when she turned 21, he married her in the White House. So we did a lot of talking about politics in those days. Now also, I had some rules. Never opened on a Sunday. That's why you can't get anything to drink today. That's why I'm talking to you out here rather than in my saloon. My brother-in-law, Mary's brother, he came down from Kenosha one Sunday. He wanted to see the family business. Well, I wouldn't show it to him. It was Sunday. So he went back to Kenosha and never saw it. Also, never served a drunk. If you'd had too much to drink, I wasn't going to give you any more. We had enough trouble here in town with people falling off their horses and running their buggies into things, running people over. We didn't need that. Also, never served a free lunch. I kind of figured if you had enough to afford the beer, you could afford the food. You never knew what you got when you'd start giving away food. Also, never served a minor. If I didn't know you were 16, I wasn't going to give you anything. I wasn't going to serve you. Yeah, we knew most of the folks around here, so we knew when kids had turned 16. I ran a good, clean place. People come to my place to have good conversation and talk about issues of the day. In fact, I ran such a good place that the city of Elgin told me I could open on a Sunday. No, I just wouldn't do it. Sunday's the day you need to be in church. Well, Mary and I had 4 kids. George, he only lived to see the age of 9. We had Charles, Virginia, and Clara. This was a good time to raise a family in. Well, along about 1910, there was a local boy started talking about the evils of alcohol. And we needed to get rid of it. A guy by the name of Billy Sunday from up in Dundee. Well, he was a local boy, so people kind of started paying attention to him, thinking that we ought to get rid of the alcohol. And in 1914, the township voted to go dry. Well, that put 2 breweries, Eagle Brewery and National Brewery, out of business, a bunch of saloons out of business. Well, I had a chance to sell my saloon to a guy from out of town just before the township went dry, but I couldn't do it. It just wouldn't have been honest. I knew what was coming, and I just couldn't do it. So, in May of 1914, when it was official, I just locked the door, and that was the end of it. Shut the business down. 3 years later, I passed away. A lot of my friends said some nice things about me at the funeral. Said I was an honest man. Said they could I could be trusted with whatever you had. He also said I was the kind of guy you could ride the river with, which meant that you could count on me. Well, it's nice to have folks say those things about you. I never did make it back to the old country, though. Had a grandson that made it back, Bill. I never met Bill. He was born after I passed away, but he went over to Belgium when he was 19 years old in 1944. Now, that was the Battle of the Bulge. Bill never saw his 20th birthday. At the end of the war, he was brought back home with a lot of other boys from Elgin. He was laid to rest right here by me. Now, like I say, I never knew Bill when he was alive, but ever since that time, he and I have had a good chance to get to know each other in death. I'm surrounded here with my family, my grandsons, sons, daughters. I was also privileged earlier today to be visited by a grandson, great-grandson, great-great-grandson, and a great-great-granddaughter. So it's kind of nice to have the whole family together on such a beautiful day as today. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Gilbert M. Turnbull. I was born April 23rd, 1856 in Iowa City, Iowa, and I came to Elgin at the ripe old age of 24 in 1880. When I first arrived in Elgin, I worked as a contractor, which is a really great job to have at the time because Elgin was undergoing a tremendous building boom at that particular time. People were coming from all over the area to settle in Elgin. In fact, I remember it didn't take very long at all for the watch factory employment to triple, and industries just seemed to be popping up all over the place. So it was a great time to be a contractor. A few years later, near the end of the decade, I began to design my own buildings. My first buildings were double residences and flats in order to try to meet the needs of all the new workers coming to Elgin. There's plenty of work, but not enough housing. My flats were 3-story, lower floor just below ground level, and had a wooden porch with steps leading up to the second floor entrance. Happy to say that my flats have been in use for over 90 years. I have a couple of pictures here you might be able to see a little bit. They're not the best pictures in the world, but see the windows down here below ground level and the steps leading up to the second floor entrance. Same up here, the windows over here, the steps leading up to the second floor. Basically the same kind of thing, just a little bit different style. You can see the pictures aren't black and white because in my time there was no such thing as color film. In 1888, I married Edith McKinney. We had one daughter by the name of Gilberta, kind of an unusual name for a girl. Probably can't figure out who she was named after. We'll talk a little bit more about her a little bit later on. My wife Edith was a very influential person. She loved stained glass. I called it colored glass because I thought it was cheap and tacky. But she loved stained glass so much that when I built our house at 71 Park Row, I put stained glass in 6 windows of our house. In fact, if you were to drive by that house today, you'd still see the stained glass in 4 out of the 6 original windows. Now, it no longer has stained glass in the 2 basement windows. I imagine they were broken somehow over the years. On the other windows, it's still there. Edith was also somewhat of a musician. She loved to play the piano. In fact, for a wedding present, her parents bought us an upright piano. It's a wonderful piano. The only problem was it was so big we couldn't get it into the house. So I had to remove the front window, stained glass and all, hoist the piano up in the air, push the piano through the vacated window area, and replace the stained glass. It was really a pain to get that piano in there, but once we got it in there, it provided us many years of pleasure and joy around the piano together. Edith was the kind of woman who was used to getting what she wanted. We were decorating our house at 71 Park Row, and she thought we should have those old, real heavy draperies with the ruffles on them that were popular at the time. And I hated those almost as much as I hated the stained glass. So we had reached a kind of a compromise and decided we'd go with the window shades and the thin curtains in the house. And they looked really nice. I liked them, and Edith actually liked them, so it worked out pretty well. Life with Edith was never boring, but she was a really good woman, and I loved her very much. As far as architecture is concerned, there were 2 basic firms I was involved in here in Elgin. One was with my friend David Postel in the firm of Turnbull and Postel, and a little later on with my friend William Jones in the firm of Turnbull and Jones. You can see we're very creative with our names for our firms. I designed many different buildings in Elgin, including Fire Station No. 2 in 1891, the old German Evangelical Church, which is now Faith Methodist Church, in 1893, and Sherman Hospital in 1895. One of my proudest achievements, however, was the old Elgin City Hall in 1893, built on the northeast corner of Chicago and Spring Streets, was first occupied on July 11th of that year. I have a picture again of it. You can kind of see it's kind of a crude picture, but again, very interesting. It shows how ornate the style was specifically for that time. Had a red brick exterior with a top by a clock tower and peaked slate roof all the way around. Had 3 floors and a basement, which was really large for Elgin at the time. In fact, it was so large they didn't even finish the 3rd floor. Figured they'd go back and finish the 3rd floor later on because they didn't need it. However, a little thing called a tornado came through Elgin on Palm Sunday of 1920 and ripped up the town and knocked this particular building out of line. The damage was repaired as much as possible, but the structure was weakened, and they decided it was never going to be safe to go ahead and fix the 3rd floor, so the 3rd floor was left unfinished. Sadly, this building was torn down in 1969. My last major Elgin building was the Peter Burritt building on South Grove Avenue in 1914. Mrs. Burritt wanted an impressive building in memory of her husband. So impressive, in fact, that we had a couple of arguments about what was going to be impressive and what was not impressive, and almost walked off the job during construction, but I didn't. And I guess as much as I completed anyway, Mrs. Burritt liked, and recently I just read in the paper they're going to go ahead and finish that structure completely, so that's pretty exciting. Elgin wasn't the only place I designed buildings. I did design a couple of churches and schools in Chicago. I did some work for the Borden Milk Company and the Bowman Dairy Company as well. As far as my architecture goes, I guess you might say I'm a self-made architect. I never had the proper education to be what you might call a full-fledged architect, I guess, or an official architect. But because I designed so many buildings, and none of them ever fell down, they gave me a civil architectural certificate. And so I was able to keep designing buildings. I also was training my daughter Gilberta to be my draftsman. However, I never lived long enough for me to finish her training. Besides my family, my 2 most pleasurable things in life was my work and my affiliation with the Masons, which gave me great joy and pleasure for many years. And while I was on a Wisconsin business trip, I was stricken ill on February 19th of 1919. I returned to my house, was examined by a doctor, died a few hours later that day on February 19th, 1919. The cause of death was listed as a heart attack. Thank you. You're welcome. My grave.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 11th annual cemetery walk. I am really glad that you were able to come out. I hope that what I have to say to you will be very informative and educational. I am Marie Faulkner. I am a slave. I was born on December 26, 1816. They're not really sure because they didn't keep very accurate records back then. I was born in Raleigh, North Carolina, and my mother, who was also a slave, worked as a cook in the master's home. As time went on, I became the overseer's slave girl, where I had to take care of the little boys and girls like you. I had to wash them, give them baths, wash their hair, get them dressed, and play with them. I was very lucky that I did not have to work out in the fields. Now, I had brothers and sisters, cousins, aunts and uncles that had to work on the cotton fields of the plantation, tobacco field. And I watched the overseer, who was also at that time the master, beat my brothers and sisters, aunts and uncles, if they did not work fast enough. And he had a whip that he beat them on their backs with. I watched some of my relatives die. Some of them were even lynched. They were hung by a tree because they were actually hung because they did not follow the master's rules. As I said before, my mother and I were very lucky that we lived in the big house and didn't have to work on the plantation. And the reason why we didn't have to do that was because we were what they called high yellow. And what that means is that we were light-skinned, that we were not what they known as the darkies. And so, which meant that my father could have been the master could have been my father because I was light-skinned. My mother, she also was light-skinned. And we were, as I said before, because we were high yellow, we got to live in the big house rather than the plantation. As time went on, I became the nurse for the plantation and for my master's home. I got married, and I married a man named Arthur Newsom. And when we got married, slaves back then did not have a formal wedding. And when we got married, we did what they called, we jumped the broom. We held hands, and then we were married. And that was exactly how we actually got married. As time went on, in 1862, a man by the name of Benjamin Thomas, he came from Elgin, and he came all the way to North Carolina. And he had a train, freight train, and he took 5 men, 28 women, and 77 children on this freight train back to Elgin. Now, mind you, we were still slaves. We were still property. We still belonged to the white man in North Carolina. But he brought us back here to Elgin, and it was called the contraband train. And it was called the contraband train because we were actually still slaves. We belonged to the white man there. But Mr. Thomas, he was an abolitionist, and he believed that everybody should be free, regardless of the color of the skin. So we came here to Elgin. My husband then, at that time, his name was Joe Faulkner, and we came to this place called the Kimball House. And we lived in the basement of this Kimball House, or the cellar as it was called, and we lived there for 3 years. And myself and my children, we went to the white folks' house and did domestic work. Now, domestic work is washing windows, cleaning the house, ironing. We even had to iron the men's underwear, the sheets. We had to iron everything back then. They didn't have perma-press like we do today. And we had to do all that hard work. Well, we lived in this place for 3 years, and then we moved to Gifford Street. Now there's Gifford Street and Franklin, Hickory, and all those streets together was known as Nigger Hill. And it was called Nigger Hill because the white folks said that the colored people, as we were also known as, could not live close to them. So they had a special area where we lived, and they called it Nigger Hill. Well, I lived there, and I still went out and I did my domestic work, working in the white folks' home, until I got older. And as I got older, I went to live with my daughter on Gifford Street, and I lived to be 100 years old. And when I died, the newspaper, and I died in January of 1916, the paper read, "Old Darky Mammy, Marie Faulkner, dies over 100 years old." Now, I was buried out here at Bluff City Cemetery, and there I am right here. I'm buried right up there, but I have no marker. And the reason why I don't have a marker, because back then they didn't mark colored folks. And even though today I have relatives, there's the Wheeler family and the Newsom family that live here in Elgin, they could buy me a marker. But you know what? They won't do it because they don't want to admit they had relatives that were actually slaves. Thank you very much for coming. I hope that you learned something.
My name is Melissa Lake Welch. I'm very happy to meet all of you today. You folks can call me Wealthy. That's my nickname, and everyone calls me that. Well, at least everyone used to call me that. I think I picked that name up when I was a young girl, and I was always so happy-go-lucky, pleased with the simple things in life. People thought I was so content I must be stashing some money somewhere. Anyway, the name stuck. My birthday is August 27, 1832, and I was born in Bennington, Vermont. I was one of 10 children born to Elijah and Prudence Lake, and my father was a representative for the legislature in Vermont twice. I'm very proud of that. Later, when we moved to Illinois, my father did farming in the summer months, and in the winter he minded the school. When I was 11 years old, my father decided to pick our family up and have us travel westward into the wilderness. My siblings, as well as my mother and I, were not very excited about this. We were quite frightened, not knowing what lay ahead, and also knowing that the Indians were not going to welcome us. We did, though, make it in one part, and we arrived in Eli. In fact, my father was noted as being the first man to stake a claim in Eli. This is in Lake County, and my parents today are buried at the Wakanda Cemetery, which is not far from me. In 1855, I was married to Albert Welch. He was a wonderful man who had a fascinating history. See, his father, William, was born in Dublin, Ireland, and found a way to move to Ohio as a young man. He was there married, and as land became available in Michigan, he moved up there, later transferring down to Illinois and landing right here in Elgin. In fact, my in-laws were the very first family to stake a claim in Elgin. They found a beautiful piece of land that was about 2.5 miles south of here. It was on the east side of the Fox River, and their farm eventually became named the Littlewoods. They entertained several families as many people started arriving and staking their claims. They were very happy to welcome those people in that day because they were anxious to have new neighbors. One of the families that spent some time with my in-laws were the Giffords. And as Mr. Gifford was trying to decide where he would like to settle, he stayed with the Welch family. When he did decide, he borrowed the ox plow from my father-in-law, and together they went down and did a furrow, made the official stake for the claim, which was in downtown Elgin. My mother-in-law had some fascinating Indian stories. Would you kids like to hear a couple? Would that be okay? They're real-life Indian stories. I think they're pretty fun. See, my mother-in-law told me that one day she was in the kitchen cooking bread, baking some bread for the family, tending the little ones while the older ones were outside with the farm and their father. Well, as the story goes, there were 3 Indians that smelled this wonderful fresh bread, and they wandered into the house hoping to steal these loaves of bread when my mother-in-law wasn't looking. So the 3 of them snatched these loaves of bread from this oven that was sitting on some hot coals in the fireplace, and all 3 of the Indians burned their hands pretty badly. They were hooting and howling and carrying on, to the astonishment of my mother-in-law, who went running to the door and summoned my father-in-law to come immediately remove the Indians from the house. Well, with all this commotion going on, several Indians appeared around the outside of the house. They weren't there to start any trouble, they just wanted to know what was going on. Well, my father-in-law felt sorry for those 3 Indians that burnt their hands, figured if they were going to go through all that trouble to try to get some fresh bread, he'd help them out. So he went back in the house, took all the loaves of bread, cut some nice big-sized portions of bread, and took it outside and shared it with all of the Indians. So he made some friends that day, and then later that afternoon they had a shooting match. But a friendly shooting match. They were target practicing. The Indians were quite impressed that my father-in-law was quite a shot. Another Indian story is that my husband, Albert, who was the 9th child born to the Welch family, also born in 1834, which would make him the very first white child born in Elgin. And you can see that there's a monument here noting that. One day he was taking a nap as an infant, and my mother-in-law turned around only to find him missing. She immediately knew what happened, and without even telling my father-in-law, she marched over to the Indian camp where she found an Indian squaw holding the beautiful white child. The Indian squaw did not want to return the baby, but my mother-in-law had a way with words, and it wasn't long before my husband was back in his mother's arms. Another thing that happened to my husband when he was about 10 years old was he was playing outside, and a barn door fell on his head and crushed his skull. It was horrible. Everyone thought he was going to die. But to the amazement of all these people, there were 2 doctors locally. There was Dr. Teft, who was in Elgin, and Dr. Goodwin, who was summoned from West Dundee, who came down to assist Dr. Teft. These 2 men performed a surgery on my husband. Now this was very amazing. In the 1850s, we were very few implements to work with. What they did was they removed the crushed portions of bone, and in place they inserted a metal plate. My husband gained complete health and did just fine. My husband was a wonderful man who was involved with nurseries. He also worked for the Express. We had a very wonderful marriage, 4 great kids, but we did have one little problem. See, I took up a liking for smoking a corncob pipe. My husband didn't quite think that was proper. He thought it was inappropriate for a woman to smoke a corncob pipe. But you know, folks, this is my Sunday dress. Normally, when I'm in the house doing my chores, I've got my apron on and my work dress. And sometimes, if I'm not doing chores around the house, I'm outside in the field helping my husband. So I felt like if I wanted to smoke a corncob pipe, I was going to do that, and he better not give me any trouble. One time he started to talk about my corncob pipe, and I said, Albert, if you don't leave me alone, I'm just going to knock that plate right out of your head. I've never heard anything after that. Anyway, I lived here for 69 wonderful years, enjoying every minute of Elgin. I lived to be 80 years old, and I died in 1912. Buried next to me are my husband and my daughter and her husband. I also had 3 other sons. And I have to tell you that my great-great-granddaughter is among these groups today. So if you see her, her name is Rosemary Freeman. Please send her on over, because I want to share some family traditions with her.
W.D. Atchison is my name, William Dowling to be correct. I was one of 13 children that was born to Matthew and Margaret Atchison. I was born in February 19th, 1833 in Mercer County, Pennsylvania. I spent the first 14 years of my life there. They were rather nondescript 14 years, except for one instance when I was 13 years old. I had a profound experience that would affect me throughout my life. And what that was that as I was laying in bed one night, I experienced the Lord. I had a revelation. And I knew then that what my calling would be, that I would become a minister and I would serve the Lord. Well, in 1847, our family packed up and moved, and we left Pennsylvania, and we moved all the way to northwestern Illinois, where we took up residence in Joe Daviess County, which is way out here in the northwest corner of Illinois. It encompasses the town of Galena, which was a thriving lead mining community back then. And we lived about 15 miles southeast of Galena. I lived out in the country, and I attended some county schools to finish my schooling. In 1848, when that was complete, the year after we had moved, I went to Mount Carroll, to the college there, Mount Carroll Seminary. And for the next 3 years, I took courses that I felt would help give me a background, a theological background, to become a minister. I finished my work at Mount Carroll in 1851, and I did some part-time school teaching in the county schools in Joe Daviess, and I also found time to go to Beloit College and take a few courses at Beloit that would help me. In 1852, I completed my course of study at Beloit, and I was ready to start work. The trouble was that there were no ministerial positions available, and so I became a school teacher in a little town called Elizabeth. And for the next 2 years, I worked in Elizabeth teaching school. In 1854, I got a calling. The Rock River Conference of the Methodist Church in Illinois, which had responsibility for Methodist churches all across northern Illinois, asked me to become a minister. But not a regular minister, mind you. I was to become a circuit rider. Now, I don't know if you know what a circuit rider was, but this was the rather unique situation that the Methodist Church had developed to meet the spiritual needs of people in sparsely settled areas. And in northwestern Illinois, there were not a lot of towns, and hence there were not a lot of churches, but there were people scattered out here who had religious needs. And so what the Methodists did that made them so attractive to people out here was they hired young men like myself to be ministers, and they gave us a circuit, a route. I had 20 stops on my circuit that I worked in this region of the country for the next 2 years. And what I did was I traveled from place to place, and I met the spiritual needs of people. I would conduct a church service. I could do a wedding, baptisms, even a funeral. I could counsel with people, but I would spend a day or two at each place, oftentimes staying with people, conducting services in homes, town halls, schools, barns. In nice weather, we even met outdoors. And people out here got to know that approximately once every month I was going to be around for a couple of days. It was during these times as the circuit rider that I met a young woman from Galena, Hannah Jane Cook, and in 1855 we were married and would remain for the next 62 years. I soon realized that having a wife and soon to start a family, that being a circuit rider was not the way to go. It just wasn't the kind of life that I envisioned. Luckily for me, the Methodist Church in Savannah on the Mississippi River, an opening developed there. And so I was able to get a full-time position in a community in Savannah ministering to the people's needs. I spent the next 2.5 years in Savannah and then moved back up the road to the church in Elizabeth. And I was in Elizabeth at the Methodist Church when the Civil War broke out. Now, I had a deep commitment to the North. I thought slavery was real evil, a moral evil. In fact, ever since I was able to vote, from 1856 on, I always cast a ballot for the Republican Party because they were opposed to the expansion of slavery. And I looked at what could I do to help in this terrible tragedy that was unfolding. Well, the one thing I thought I could do that would really be helpful was I could go out, and I had established a lot of contacts in this region, especially in the lead mines around Galena. And I could do some recruiting for the Union cause. And so, when I wasn't ministering in Elizabeth, I was busy out drumming up enlistments for the Union Army. In particular, I had a lot of good luck with young men being willing to enlist from the lead mines around Galena. One in particular, the Wellborn lead mine, I got so many men to enlist from that one that they often referred to themselves as the Wellborn Lead Mine Regiment. Now, if you look at the official war records, you won't find a regiment by that name. Instead, you'll find the 45th Illinois, which was the formal name of this regiment. But for the men who served, they'll always remember themselves as the Wellborn Lead Mine Regiment. During the war years, I was moved to a church in Belvedere. And it was while I was at Belvedere that I received a letter from some of the men that I had enlisted. They were serving in the 45th, which was attached to General Sherman's army. And in the summer of 1864, General Sherman was advancing on Atlanta, Georgia. And the 45th had lost their chaplain. And some of the men remembered me, and they wrote me a letter and asked if I would like to come and be the chaplain for the 45th. Well, after a consultation with my wife, I decided this was something that I could do, and so I left and went south, and I joined up with the 45th Illinois Infantry Regiment shortly after Sherman had taken Atlanta. And he was getting ready for his famous March to the Sea when I appeared on the scene, and I would be with the boys for the entire duration of the campaign till the end of the war. And believe me, this was an event that I'll never forget. What General Sherman was about to do was embark on a campaign with 60,000 men spread across a line 60 miles wide in the middle of the state of Georgia. And their objective was to move these 60,000 men southeastward to the Atlantic Ocean and to destroy everything in their path, anything that could be of any use to the Confederacy. Well, the boys in the 45th, like all the rest of these 60,000, they relished this job. It was easy work. There was only token opposition from the Confederates at this time. And they particularly enjoyed destroying railroads. And they liked to leave their calling card whenever they came across a stretch of railroad. They would leave what they called Jeff Davis neckties. They would tear up the track. and then they would pull out the ties and build a big bonfire with the railroad ties, take the pieces of track that they had torn up, and lay them across this fire. And when the track got white hot in the middle, it was malleable, they'd pick up the track by the ends, and they'd go to the nearest post or tree, and they'd twist the track around, and they would leave their calling card, a Jeff Davis necktie. I'm told today that in 1917 you can still find a few of these neckties laying around in central Georgia. Well, I was with the 45th till the end of the war in April of '65 in North Carolina, and then I came back to Illinois. And the conference assigned me to a congregation here in Elgin. There was a rapidly growing congregation of Methodists in the city of Elgin. So I arrived here late in 1865, found that the congregation had outgrown its temporary home, needed a new church. So 1866 and 1867 saw a big campaign to raise funds and build a new church, which happened. And by 1868, we were involved. We were in a new building, big enough to hold this growing membership. And then it was time for me to leave again. Now, I've since heard, after I left here, the first time when I left, in '68, that there were some problems with the finances of this church. It seems that some of the people who made pledges didn't honor their pledges. But I can assure you that everybody that I talked to, I urged them to stay within their means when they pledged money, and that I don't feel responsible for anything. Anyway, the Methodist Church saw fit to transfer me. And for the next 23 years, I'm going to be moving with my family across northern Illinois. Now, the Methodist Church had this position that a minister should not remain more than 3 years in any community in a church. It wasn't good, it wasn't healthy. And so for the next 23 years, from 1868 to 1891, I would find myself doing this. I left Elgin in '68 and went to Kankakee in east central Illinois. And I was there for approximately 3 years, and I was moved back to Galena. Hannah liked that, it was her hometown. So we would be back in Galena, familiar territory. I was there for 3 years. Then, move across the state to Aurora, south of Elgin, and I was pastor of the Methodist Church on the corner of 4th Street in Aurora. From there, I was moved to Oak Park, Methodist Church in Oak Park. Just got comfortable in Oak Park and got moved up to Waukegan, which was kind of nice on Lake Michigan. Didn't get to stay there very long, and I was moved back to kind of northwestern Illinois down to Sterling on the Rock River. Pretty sight. Spent about 3 years there. Moved me down to Princeton. Nice rural farm community, lots of historical roots. Spent about 3 years there, and then I was moved back to Sycamore. And after Sycamore, I got a second stint in Galena. So we went back in 1888 to Galena, and after 3 years, 1891, decided that I'd had enough of the ministry and it was time to retire. So in 1891, I tendered my resignation and retired. Hannah and I were interested in moving somewhere with the family. We had a total of 6 boys and 2 girls had been born to us. 2 of the boys had died young, but we still had 6 children, 2 of whom were going to become ministers. I was very proud of that. And we'd always liked the stay we had in Elgin. So in 1891, we moved back to Elgin for a second time, final time. We bought a house on Columbia Street, where I would spend out the rest of my life. I found a lot to do here in Elgin. I was not a full-time minister, but I found some things that I was deeply interested in. There was a very active lodge of the Grand Army of the Republic. And I remembered my days of recruitment and serving as chaplain, and so I became very active in the lodge affairs of this chapter. I also found that there were a lot of men who had served in the 45th who had come to Elgin and settled, and when they found I was here, why, they wanted me to perform a wedding for them or their sons, grandchildren. Eventually I even performed a few weddings for. I did funerals, I did baptisms. I was always willing to speak. I was always, especially one day of the year, on 30th of May, we always came out to the cemetery and we strew flowers on the graves of the fallen soldiers from the Civil War. And I would always deliver I felt a very moving oration reminding people of the sacrifice that these men had made to keep the country together. I couldn't quite shake the ministry, though, completely, and in 1897, I accepted a position, kind of a volunteer position, as chaplain at the Northern Illinois Hospital for the Insane, which is about 2 miles west of here. And my official duties were to deliver a sermon on Sunday morning. But I found that more often than not, I was out during the week, walking the halls, meeting the needs of patients. And I did that for 4 years. Gradually, as time passed, my circle of friends grew smaller and smaller as years passed, and I slowed down, and here it is 1917, and I'm getting ready to go home and retire and go to sleep and not get up and just die peacefully of old age. And I thank you.
Well, you all took it out?
Yeah.
Well, P.B. Pratt is certainly pleased that you've all come out here on this fine afternoon. It's so nice when folks are willing to leave their homes and come out and enjoy the wonderful outdoors and share it with each other. Do you know that we have got here in Elgin one of the most perfect and wonderful examples of horticulture in the entire state of Illinois? Excuse me for a minute, I didn't introduce myself formally, did I? Well, I am Dr. Philemon Brown Pratt, dentist, cattle breeder, fish raiser, naturalist, husband to my wife Mary, father, we have 4 children, Nellie and Eva, Willie May, who's a dentist in practice with me, and we lost young Edmund there at 57. He was just a boy. Sometimes when people hear me speak, they can also tell that I'm a transplanted Vermonter, born in Brattleboro in 1814. Mary and I came here as a young couple, and we loved Illinois. It's been good for us and our family. But I must confess a certain spot inside me for my home state back east. It's so nice to recall the rolling hills and valleys, the greenness of the forest. So, I'd like to ask if there's any of you that have ever had one of those remarkable and totally unexpected experiences that you felt left you changed for life. May I share that with you? Well, you know, it was in 1854. I think it was one of those periods of homesickness. I had been practicing dentistry, first in Chicago, and here in Elgin for a few years. I think probably as a relief from the stress of everyday business, I had developed a custom of walking an old Indian trail that led from Elgin up along the east side of the Fox River towards the town of Dundee. Oh, I had walked that trail 6, perhaps 7 years. Never once in that time had I ever ventured off the main path until then. It was a day when there was an unusual wind. It was blowing from the east to the west. I got to a spot about, a mile and a half north of town, and I felt something strange. It was an unusual coolness in the air and a fragrance. It was a fragrance that I hadn't noticed since I was a boy playing in the woods near Brattleboro. It was an effect of that coolness of nature warming my heart in such a way that I couldn't resist turning off the trail. I went off the trail to the east, through the woods, towards the bluffs. And as I got deeper into the woods, the aroma, the spicy, pungent smell became stronger. In the air, it became even cooler and cooler. I mean, it was like walking into Carver's Ice House in the middle of August. The ground was wet, soft and spongy. Now, I knew that they had called this place the Cedar Swamp for years, but it was nothing like I had imagined it to be. It wasn't scary. It didn't make me want to leave like a murky, dark swamp. No, it drew me in. Why, there were crystal clear streams gurgling through the place, And there were packed gravel beds with sand so clean that you could step in and your boots wouldn't even get muddy. And as I walked and approached the bluffs before me for just an instant, I imagined that I was back wading in the icy waters of the Battenkill River in Vermont with my pole in hand and my creel beside me, open and waiting for its fill of silvery trout. Oh, I didn't waste any time. I tell you, I looked up Theron B. Cook, the owner of that land, and I made him an offer. I purchased 173 acres, and I was home for the rest of my life. It was a wonderful place. I loved that land. Before long, the botanists around the area had cataloged over 100 varieties of wonderful trees and plants that thrived in that place. Why, there were the bright red berries on top, the long reed-like stems of jack-in-the-pulpit, and the small, deceptively beautiful white flowers of the snakeroot plant. And then there was always the yellow stick-tights that you brought home on your pant legs, whether you wanted to or not. And then the delicate, pale lavender flowers of the arrowleaf asters. And all of this growing and more, growing under the shadows of the wonderful white cedar trees that had called this place home for thousands of years. Well, I didn't waste any time in completing that picture that I had imagined in my mind. I dug some ponds and stocked them with trout. Then, later, I fenced in about 70 acres and introduced deer and elk. It was a wonderful place to visit. At first, they called it Pratt's Pond. And then later, after the fish I introduced there, Trout Pond. You know, when I bought that land, I didn't know what was the secret of its wonderful climate. But here's what I found out. You see, thousands of years ago, after the glaciers had carved out the gullies and melted to form the Fox River, the climate in this part of Illinois was much colder than it is now. So cold, in fact, that it supported the northern white cedar and other varieties. They were all over the state. But soon as the climate warmed, most of them died out. Except that is, this tiny little pocket nestled in between the Fox River and the bluffs to the east. You see, for those thousands of years, the Fox River had provided protection against these raging prairie fires that would always come from the west. And they stopped there. And for those same thousands of years, this little spot had been nourished and cooled by the calcium-laden underground springs that brought forth from the down deep levels of the earth. And so you see, this was the secret. This was what made this place so wonderful and kept those wonderful things thriving there. I loved that special place, and I spent the rest of my life there until I passed on in 1872. I dearly hope that it's been preserved for you and for your children. And if it still is, please, keep it well for all of us. Thank you.
Hi, how are you all doing?
Hey.
I'm Clay, Henry Clayton Wood actually, but please call me Clay. I was just trying to get my rings to work, but they're broken, and I lost the instructions. But I was born in Elgin in 1916, and I lived most of my life here. During that time, I had several different jobs in the area. I worked at the Courier News as a photographer for several years, and I worked as a watch repairman. I had my own business after training at the Elgin Watch Factory. I also participated in several different community organizations. I was involved with the Hiawatha Indian Pageant several years running, and I also spent a great deal of my free time at the Sherman Hospital, just hanging out, entertaining the patients and the people who work there. That was all a lot of fun, but never really had anything to do with my two real loves in life, and that was magic and the circus. I've always loved the circus. I remember back when I was just a kid, my friend Ralph Freimark and I decided we wanted to join the circus. And I went and I asked my mom if I could run away from home and be an acrobat, and she said no. Ralph's mom wasn't too keen on the idea either. I guess we should have found that discouraging, but we had a really good idea. If we couldn't join the circus, we'd make one of our own. Only problem was we had nowhere to keep the elephants. So Ralph had a really brilliant idea. We'd make the circus really small. So we got some wood and some fabric. I got my dad's tools, and we started building the best little circus you've ever seen. We had a big top tent. No. We had a big top tent. We had little circus wagons for carrying around little circus tigers. We had a very low high wire rack. And we invited the whole neighborhood to come and see it. And everyone loved it. They all agreed that it was the best little circus they'd ever seen. That was the first circus I ever got to be involved with. Later, as I got older, I was able to participate in some more people-sized circuses. I was the producer for the Carson and Barnes Wild Animal Circus. That was back in the 70s. I was a member of the Circus Fans Association of America, and I directed and produced the only indoor circus ever to perform at the Hemmons Auditorium here in Elgin. When I got the chance to be in the Joe Tilley Carnival, that was the first time I ever got to actually perform in a large circus, or a circus-type venue, rather. I started off there as the human pincushion. You know what that is? When I take these long needles and I stick them in my nose for entertainment. The audience's entertainment, not mine. That was a lot of fun, but what I really wanted to do with them was be the fire eater. I've always had this morbid fascination with taking flaming torches and putting them in my mouth. Don't ask me why. They finally agreed to teach me how to do it, and I almost chickened out. It looks like a lot of fun, it looks easy, but when you're holding a flaming torch 2 inches from your nose, you can smell the kerosene, you feel the heat on your face, it takes on a new perspective, trust me. The largest circus that I ever got to work with was the Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus. I'm sure you've all heard of this one, the greatest show on earth. With them, I was their photographer. It was my job to follow around the performers and the animals during rehearsals and take pictures of them doing their thing. I'd also take pictures during the act, and after the show, we would sell the pictures to the circus fans as souvenirs. While I was at Ringling Brothers, I became very good friends with their lion tamer, a man named Clyde Beatty. And Clyde had written several books about circus life during his lifetime. And he was working on his last one at the time that I knew him. And he asked me if he could use my photographs as illustrations. And it was about that time that Clyde gave me the name Showman's Photographer, which is carved on my tombstone. Also on my tombstone is a little magician's top hat, which is really cool. My first magic show was also when I was just a kid. I was 8 years old at the time, and I decided to put on a magic show for my friends at school. Not all my friends, just the boys, because it was in the boys' washroom. I had this really great trick where I would take a coin and I'd put it in my hand. And just before I could show them the coin was gone, I felt another hand on my shoulder, a very large hand. I looked up, and there was my teacher looking down at me. And he wasn't too happy that I was using study time to be doing magic tricks. So as punishment, he thought it'd be a good idea to make me put on a show for the Parents Association that night. And that was a great punishment, trust me. 8 years old, and I already had my very own captive audience. I lost my watch. Getting close to 5 minutes. Anyone have anything they want to ask? I don't have an ending for this. I can just talk about me all day. Couldn't you?
Did you have kids?
Yeah, I had a kid. She's here. Pick her out. She's wearing pink and yellow. That's my daughter over there.
What was your wife like? I mean, did she live in Elgin?
Welcome to Willow City Cemetery. How nice of you to visit us this afternoon on this warm September day. We always enjoy company. My name is Josephine Smith Wood. With your permission, I would like to share with you my life story. I was born not here in Elgin, but in Plainfield, New York in 1849. I received a fine Christian training in my early years. My first schooling occurred in a little schoolhouse on our family farm. Later, I attended West Winfield Academy, and from 1867 to 1868, I attended the seminary in Cazenovia, New York, which was where I met my husband, Delmont E. Wood. Delmont and I were married in 1870. We immediately traveled west, settling first in Garden Prairie, Illinois, then Huntley, and finally arriving in Elgin in 1881. In 1884, we built our beautiful home at 178 South State Street. There is a sketch of it here, which I would encourage you to come look at in a while. It was a beautiful home. Unfortunately, it was demolished in 1980 to make way for a parking lot, despite efforts to save it. I have many memories left of that home, and a shade, which was taken from one of the gas light fixtures in our home. Delmont and I were fortunate to have 4 lovely children, a set of twins, Florence and Frank, and Lillian and Francis. Now my husband Delmont, perhaps you have heard of him, was quite an enterprising businessman. He bought the firm and ran the firm, the D.E. Wood Butter Company, which later in 1909 was purchased by the B.S. Pearsall Butter Company. He was also involved in many other business ventures and was quite successful. He was influential with other butter and cheese men in establishing the Elgin Board of Trade. I am unfamiliar with your knowledge of this board. It was thought that Elgin was an excellent location to have a meeting place to sell butter and cheese. In 1872, a committee was formed and that such a board was established. A unique aspect of this proposal was that the buyer would come to the seller rather than the reverse. This would eliminate a middleman. Now at first, the cheese and butter men in Chicago and surrounding cities were amused at this unique proposal, but then became quite indignant and actually boycotted the Board of Trade. If not for my husband and other persistent businessmen, the board certainly would have failed. However, it did not. I would like to read to you from the Elgin Board of Trade Annual Report in 1883. The Board of Trade is now so firmly established and so well known in the United States and Europe as to need no special grooming to bring it to the attention of dealers or manufacturers. During the year just closed, the board was the monitor to which a large portion of this country at least looked for prices on dairy products. But in 1890, more than 24 million pounds of butter and 5 million pounds of cheese were sold. Well, as I said, Delmont was quite a busy, enterprising young man. He was so busy that he found very little time for the family. He did find a little time to play golf. He played golf when he could at home here in Elgin or at the country club in Lake Geneva, where we had a summer home. Well, because of his success, I was allowed a considerable amount of free time. I was able to hire a staff to maintain our beautiful home. Mrs. Gross, our housekeeper, did a wonderful job of doing so. What did I do with my time? Well, I was not, as my obituary stated, actively involved in social clubs and organizations in the city. Many women of my stature were. I also was not particularly involved in politics, although I did read the newspapers and was quite informed as to politics. I left the issues to my husband, who was a staunch Republican. I was involved in our church. I was a member, as was our family, of Grace Methodist Church for many, many years. And I taught Sunday school for 40 of those years. I also was a member of the Ladies' Aid and Missionary Society. Now, these organizations, the function was to provide funds to send home and abroad for missions, to visit the elderly and the sick, and to provide a place for Christian fellowship for women and for Bible study. I thought perhaps, if you were wondering what my days were like, But I would read to you from a page of my engagement calendar. I found a page from October 15th, 1899. I thought I would share this with you to let you know how busy I actually was. I started the morning with breakfast with my husband, Delmont. We did this regularly, for it was a very important time for us to share with our family issues. I then met with Mrs. Gross, our housekeeper, and discussed dinner plans, for we were having guests for dinner this evening. See? One of my daily activities was engaging in correspondence. I did this regularly, and I see on October 15th that I wrote to my cousin Mildred in New York and to my friend Myrtle in Huntley. I then dropped in to see my daughter Frances, who lived just a few blocks on State Street, down the street, to visit her and her children. Well, after lunch, it was time for the ladies' aid meeting. Our agenda included Bible study and then a discussion of a plan for a church dinner. We held many church dinners, for it was quite a successful fundraiser for the church, I must say. After the meeting, I visited two of our elderly members who were homebound, and then came home to prepare myself, rest myself for dinner. Dinner that evening was with a mother and her daughter, a mother whose husband had recently died, and her 8-year-old daughter, which I felt so sorry for her, and I invited them all to dinner. Well, that was my evening. After our guests left, I took time to read a little. I love to read the classics. I was quite interested in reading, and of course, read the daily newspaper. It was time for evening to retire. I had a very full and life full of joys and full of rewards, I believe. I lived to the age of 84. I developed pneumonia, and after a few days died, and my daughter said, Frances. But I was buried, or what had the cemetery, the funeral service in our home, on 178 South State Street. I've had a very busy life, as I said, but fulfilling. I see I still have a few visits to make that I didn't make on October 15th, so I must say goodbye to you. I know you have a few visits to make also. Thank you so much for your attention, and good afternoon.
Of an endless day, when I pack my weary cares away, I find a shady tree waiting me round evening. Close beside me is an old mill stream, just a place where I can sit and dream. There in a cooling breeze, I'm at ease round evening. And by a garden gate, tulips are waiting to greet me. And down the lane, two tiny feet come running to meet me. This old world's been mighty good to me, and my happy little family. I bless the one above for his love round evening.
Pack up all my cares and woe. Here I go, singing low. Bye, bye, blackbird. When somebody waits for me, sugar sweet, so is she. Bye, bye, blackbird. No one here can love or understand me. Oh, what hard luck stories they all hand me. Make my bed and light the light. I'll arrive late tonight. Blackbird, bye-bye. Bye-bye, blackbird. Bye-bye, blackbird. No one here can love or understand.